church. Welcome to my home office. It's kind of messy, honestly, but I have I have a bookshelf and inspirational wall stuff, and then a desk, and I can't. Here, and a window. I can see the neighbor kid's house. It's nice. So welcome. Welcome to week 3, session 3 of Sabbath as Resistance. This week is Sabbath as Witness. And I am sorry that I am unable to meet with you face to face, but I am glad to be able to even meet with you virtually. I like the part where I talk and you listen. That's why I became a pastor, really. Next week, I figured out how we can do this interactively and actually have discussion. I have 2 different options that I'm still testing out, but if you can, please plan on going ahead and meeting next Wednesday at 7, which would have been our normal time. I have my notes here, so I'm going to look at them and teach. I'm new to this. Is this still even recording? It is. This is still recording. Some people are experts, and anyway, I'm going to figure this out. I will attach the PDF of my notes so that you can look at it as we go. Okay. I have learned in the last days. Oh, here, let me turn on the light. You can see me even better. Watch this. This is my twilight zone. But, here. Yeah, okay. It's a little better. Alright. I have learned in the last few days about working on creating ritual online to be able to worship with each other at a distance. And one of the things that they have suggested is taking a candle, each of us taking a candle. You didn't know, so it's okay. But each of us taking a candle and lighting it, this is a battery candle, to signify coming into the worship space, that we're all entering into that. So I'm going to suggest that for church on Sunday. I'm going to go ahead and light the candle here to signify that we've entered into worship. And I'm going to begin with prayer. I'm going to read the prayer from session 5, which is page 117. We come to worship longing to encounter you, O God. Yet often our attention is scattered, our minds on other things. And sometimes we are fully attending, but not to your presence. Rather, our minds and hearts are occupied with other gods, the cultural gods of commodity. Call us to account. Give us the strength of will to resist. Turn us to you and away from commodity. Help us to worship in spirit and truth. Amen. So, session 1, we talked about Sabbath as freedom. That's kind of, Brueggemann's underlying premise for this book. Sabbath is freedom, and he talks about it specifically as freedom from anxiety. And this is not just the emotional, chemical anxiety that some of us have, that's sometimes wholly irrational, but the anxiety, the stress, the care, the worry of the world. So the broader idea of anxiety, not specifically just the mental illness. So we talked the first week about Sabbath as freedom, specifically from anxiety. And the anxiety to produce all the time. The anxiety that we must always be working. Stephanie Crable, she's a Mennonite that works with victim advocacy stuff. I follow her. And she wrote something this week that I was like, okay, that's dead on. So I'm going to scroll to the bottom. Or no, I have it on my phone. But on your PDF, it should be at the bottom, I think, because I'm having trouble getting it in line with the text. Okay, this is kind of long, so scroll down and read along with me. Okay, so Stephanie says, I keep thinking about how ineffective our capitalist ideas of productivity and work are in equipping us to deal with a pandemic. For one thing, a lot of us don't really think that we deserve a place on the planet if we're not being productive in a capitalist sense. We attach moral value to constant productivity, so it's really hard for us to accept individually and collectively that there could ever be any situation in which less productivity is morally better. So we devalue and make life hell for people whose bodies and or brains make this kind of productivity impossible and beat ourselves up for every moment that we're not working. That attitude is making the idea of staying home during the pandemic really difficult for a lot of my socioeconomic peers. Okay, so she goes on, but she's talking about this idea that we have this moral attachment to being productive, so that and people my age, they call it a hustle, that, always be hustling, that, we go to work during the day, and then what we do on the weekends is like, I don't know, sell nail polish or makeup or whatever to make, our hobbies are supposed to even be monetizable, that we make a craft and we sell the craft on Etsy, that sort of thing. And so she talks about, Stephanie's making the case, that the idea of inactivity being not only morally permissible, but morally better. In this moment, this inactivity, this staying in our homes is morally better. And she's talking about how that's really hard for us to grok. And so she goes on. She says, we're also a kleptocracy, which means that the social flourishing of our fortunate classes is dependent on thievery from others whose lives and labor are rendered invisible. But it's not just the richest of the rich who are dependent on exploited invisible labor. We all are, even when our own labor is being exploited. That's how our economy is structured. Everything from our food to our tech to our transportation is dependent on undercompensated or outright stolen labor. So yeah, poor people have to work hard and they don't get sick days. What does she say? The role of work in the moralistic lies we tell to justify this system is fascinating. Our upper economic classes actually seem to really believe that they work harder than poor people, which blows my mind. Like, what do you think is harder? Like, I don't know, being a CEO or being a hotel maid? Like, being a hotel maid. Our upper economic classes seem to actually believe that they work harder than poor people. Everyone would grind to a halt without the continuous labor of entire underclasses of people who don't have the option of staying home when a pandemic hits. And yet our normative understanding of how our economy works is still burdened by this idea that poor people are poor because they don't work enough. And then she says some things that aren't just exceedingly relevant. And she says, there's no way to make the impacts of this disease equitable. That ship sailed long before COVID-19 existed. Poor, disenfranchised people are going to suffer the most. You can't change that by going out in solidarity. But her point here, poor, disenfranchised people are going to suffer the most. We know that. And yet, this idea that us not working is morally better is hard for us, okay? When we talked about Sabbath as freedom, we also talked about how Sabbath isn't this list of rules and restrictions that we need to keep perfectly. And it's intended to be life-giving and not punitive. And last week we talked a little bit about like what is good to do on Sabbath, not just what do we need to avoid. So Sabbath is freedom was week 1. Okay, week 2, last week, we talked about Sabbath as resistance to culture. And we discussed what a contrast community is. And essentially, at its most basic level, a contrast community is a group of people that looks different, is in contrast to the greater society around it. And there can be different types of contrast communities. Like, I think I suggested that goth people, and their black clothes are a contrast community. Hell's Angels, contrast community. But the church should be a contrast community oriented to the reign of God. That should be, what we look like, what people see. That's the center of our contrast community that draws us in. And we talked about all of this resistance of culture, and I specifically highlighted trust. Do we trust in ourselves to, when we talk about having enough, we talked about having enough. Is having enough based on how much work I do? Is having enough based on how well the stock market does? Is having enough based on how well our church giving goes? Is it based on my farm community? Is that where our trust is? Or is our trust actually in God and God's provision? And so to cease from working, to take a day off, and cease from working and cease from production forces us to put our trust in something that's not ourselves, namely God, the God whose reign we desire to usher in. So here we are, week 3, Sabbath as witness. And we have talked, those last 2 were really more sort of individualistic ideas. I mean, we did talk community and contrast community, but we are talking kind of like, well, what do I get out of Sabbath? Why should I do this? Why is it good for me? And today I want to talk more about to the communal, like, how is Sabbath good to our community around us? And by being good to our community around us, how is it then a witness? Like, if people see this contrast community and see us living differently and want to join, everything just glitched there. I hope that was normal for you. Yeah, see us living differently and want to be a part of it. I mean, like, I can see the Hells Angels living differently, but I don't want to do it. And so this contrast community needs to both reveal the reign of God when people see us and invite them into the reign of God. So so being visible and then incorporating people in. And then, of course, next week, week 4, we'll talk about living as Sabbath people. So, our quick review. Week 1, the challenge was to cut something out of your Sunday or your Sabbath, whatever day you happen to practice that on, and give yourself more rest and less anxiety. Like, what can you identify to cut out? And last week I said, I want to cut out watching TV or technology and be more unplugged on my Sabbath. But there's just so much good basketball. And the coronavirus, it solved it for me. There has not been basketball for days. I have been watching just old highlights from classics like Michael Jordan, slam dunks. It's it's rough. There is no basketball. But I have been forced to cut out some technology. And it is Sabbathful. And another thing that I am working on is being truly present in my home. Not just physically present, but emotionally present and available to my family. So think about, what is it that you have cut out of your Sunday Sabbath to relieve your anxiety? What are you doing less of? What are you cutting out? And how is it going? Did you remember to do this? Did you remember that we were doing this class at all? Those sorts of things. And if we were together now, I would have you share those, or maybe turn to a partner and share them. So if you are watching this with maybe your spouse or your cats, Jeanette, turn to them and, discuss this tiny group discussion. And then you can pause if you want to. You're like, okay. Then, last week, we were to identify habits that are anxiety producing, not only for us, but also for our neighbors, and work on cutting those out. I'm going to be honest with you. I completely forgot to work on this at all. It's been a week, and it feels like it feels like a lot more than 7 days ago that we met for this class, for sure. So if you also didn't work on this, that's okay. Go ahead and bring it back to the front of your mind. What habits do you have that might be anxiety producing, not only for you, but also for your neighbors? If we're talking about our literal neighbors and you are mowing at like 1 p.m. during baby's nap time, I would love for you to stop doing that. Oh my goodness. When my kids were little, I had a neighbor that mowed all the time during nap time. So, maybe on your Sabbath, don't mow. Those are our literal neighbors. Maybe our more metaphorical neighbors, we can cut out things like eating at restaurants or shopping. Just trying to disengage from capitalism, from buying and consuming on Sundays. I try and do that. I try not to order anything on Amazon or really go to stores unless I just need some milk, whatever. I try not to purchase things on Sundays. Just so there's less demand on that day. And it's not like Sundays itself is special, Jerry. It's not like that is special, but because it is the day that Christians have traditionally practiced a Sabbath, there is still some residual of that in society. And so perhaps more critical mass there. Okay, so coronavirus, COVID-19, whatever things we want to call it, this global pandemic. Last Wednesday, as I was teaching this class, I wondered even if we would meet together this week. And I thought it was possible that we wouldn't be. And it was right. And even at that time, I thought, in what ways is us needing to stay home potentially Sabbath? Potentially. And of course, so if we're talking about Sabbath as resistance to anxiety, there's a lot of anxiety about coronavirus in the news, in other people, in us. If you watched my prayer time earlier, my Wednesday afternoon prayer time, I said how much anxiety Ellie is feeling just about not having a schedule. And not necessarily this week because it's supposed to be spring break anyway, but in the coming weeks till the end of the school year, she doesn't have a school schedule and she's feeling just anxiety about that. And so here, then we're in this sort of forced Sabbath, but the forced Sabbath is causing anxiety. I don't know, I guess you could just turn me off. I don't know. There's been a lot. But probably a number of you have read this poem. Last week we talked about what is good to do on Sabbath, what things do we want to do on Sabbath. Spend time with our family, spend time in nature, and things like that, right? Worship, read the Bible. We talked about what's good to do on Sabbath. And so this week, a poet named Lynn Unger wrote a poem called Pandemic, and I know Geneva at least sent it to me, and so maybe several of you have seen it. It's in the notes, but I'm going to read it. Pandemic. What if you thought of it as the Jews consider the Sabbath, the most sacred of times? Cease from travel, cease from buying and selling. Give up, just for now, on trying to make the world different than it is. Sing. Pray. Touch only those to whom you commit your life. Center down. And when your body has become still, reach out with your heart. Know that we are connected in ways that are terrifying and beautiful. You could hardly deny it now. Know that our lives are in one another's hands. Surely that's become clear. Do not reach out your hands, reach out your heart. Reach out your words. Reach out all the tendrils of compassion that move invisibly where we cannot touch. Promise this world your love, for better or for worse, in sickness and in health, so long as we all shall live. So I think that's a potentially helpful way to think about this. If we were together, I would ask you to reflect on this, to pull out the pieces and to tell me the truth that you see here. And, critique as well, but what truth do you find in this? So think about that. If you were youth, if I were teaching youth this, I would have them sit down and write their own poem about Sabbath and pandemic. Like, here's an inspiration. This is what a person did. Now you write a poem. I have found that youth will respond pretty well to that. They may be, I would give them the option to share. I wouldn't make them share. But I have found youth pretty responsive to that sort of thing because they just feel freer. And sometimes adults can have higher boundaries about being vulnerable with each other. So, since we aren't actually together, if you would, write your own poem or, free-form verse or prose, I don't care. Your own creative writing about Sabbath and pandemic. How these intersect. Yeah. And you can pause and do that now, or you can do it afterwards. And if you want to share it with me, that's cool. So, chapter 5. Here, this is my copy that has my notes in it. Chapter 5. I am going to try to explain this as how I understand it, but it's a little confusing for me. So, have some grace here. In chapter 5, Brueggemann is talking about resistance to multitasking. Do I actually want to be in chapter 5? Yeah, no. I want to be in... I want to be in chapter 4. My notes are wrong here. We'll change them. Resistance to exclusivism is what we want to talk about. And so my page 48, I don't know what page that is in the other book, but chapter 4, section 2, talks about how Sabbath in God's community works to establish boundaries of membership. It's this way of figuring out who is in and who is out in the community. And Brueggemann talks about kind of two different ways of thinking about this, the Leviticus way and the Deuteronomy way. And he talks about in the Leviticus way that having to do with cultic purity, this idea that we mark this boundary around ourselves, we put this fence up around ourselves to keep other people out, and this is how we form an identity. And of course we see that in Leviticus and throughout the Old Testament, like don't intermarry with other people, don't worship these other gods, don't eat these certain foods that other people eat. This way of identity formation as against something. But then Brueggemann says the second great interpretive tradition, Deuteronomy, instead places accent on justice questions and is preoccupied with the vulnerable who need protection by the community, the poor, alongside widows, orphans, and immigrants. Israel's identity, consists in those who practice such protective justice. So, rather than being about cultic purity, Brueggemann is saying he's trying to pull us towards this interpretive Deuteronomic, it's a $3 word, tradition of the people of God are people that take care of each other and others, are gracious to the poor, the oppressed, the weak. So rather than, a list of exclusions, it's this behavior. It's the behavior that characterizes the people of God. Okay, I'm trying to decide if I want to ask this question or read this quote next. The community, God's community, this is on my page 55, welcomes members of any race or nation, any gender or social condition, so long as that person is defined by justice, mercy, compassion, and not competition, achievement, production, or acquisition. There is no mention of purity, only work stoppage and a neighborly pause for humanness. So Brueggemann's argument is that Sabbath, defining this people, defines a type of people that are defined by mercy, justice, and compassion, and not the rat race. So, small group discussion. Question. Brueggemann claims that Sabbath keeping is a radical way to make people equal, to equal the playing field. This is an argument he has. Therefore, God's people don't become an exclusive group. And so I want to talk a little bit about how can we be both different from society, a contrast community, and inclusive, so invitational or witnessing. So I'll say, you can read it, but here's the question again. How can we be both different from society and inclusive? And let's move that out of just like the theoretical where we're thinking about, Moses and the people. Like, how can Mennonite Church of the Servant be both a contrast community and inclusive? Because we are pretty contrasty. We have some high standards for membership with the covenant and everything. And even our statement says it's like, well, we live in relational and accountable community. Like, that's not a church as commodity. That's not church as consumption. That's not church as entertainment. That is church as we expect active participation in this body. So it's a little contrasty. So how can we be both different than society and inclusive and welcoming people in? If you have somebody to discuss with, please do that. Yeah, so that's something that I would have had you talk about as a small group question. And then we would share our feedback. And then I would roll with that, but I don't have you here to do it. One of the things I would highlight is the tension between the purity of identity and the welcome. And when I talk about tensions, I'm always talking about good tensions, because like identity, it's good, and welcoming is good. And if we are just all the time welcoming and don't believe in anything, then we don't have any identity. It's just bleh. But if you have to be perfect to be a part of us, then nobody ever comes in. So we need these two, and the tension holds them both upright. So imagine it's like two poles that are trying to fall over, but we put tension on them, and that holds them up, right? Like a bridge, probably. Brueggemann, back in chapter 3, that was resistance to coercion. He says, if the goal of life is acquiring more and more, like that's our goal, we get more stuff, right? Bigger houses, more land, nicer cars, more clothes, and of course we need more and more money to do all that, right? So if the goal of life is acquiring more and more, we begin to compete with our neighbors. And especially think about that in a land-based economy. To get more and more, we have to plant more trees, we have to plant more grain, right? And so we're in competition with our neighbors for like actual physical resources, which, and so if we're in competition with our neighbor for these resources, and we can extend that to a larger society metaphor. If we're in competition with our neighbor for resources, our neighbor becomes our competitor. Competitors are threats and challenges, okay? So by making our goal of life to have more and more, We begin to compete with each other. That competition makes us enemies, rather than the goal of life being to exist in community. And so Sabbath, as a definer of God's community, is supposed to redefine the purpose of our community as centered around helping the vulnerable. So mine says, read page 40. Let's see what page 40 says. Is this the correct book? Okay. Oh, yeah. Sabbath is the great day of equality when all are equally at rest. And so that's like, okay, so say right now I have the type of job where I can stay at my house. But people that have the type of job that if they miss 2 days of work from being sick and are going to get fired, don't have an equal chance at rest. But if we demand Sabbath for all people, if we as a community demand Sabbath for all people, no matter what class we are, whether we're rich class or working class or poverty class, that you get the same quality of rest if there is a Sabbath day. So then I would point you to another small group discussion question. How is Sabbath practice a way to love our neighbors? How is Sabbath practice a way to love our neighbors? Feel free to pause, write notes. One of the things that Brueggemann says is that Sabbath is a miniature jubilee. And of course the jubilee year is every 7 years, where debts are wiped away. And the land is returned to its individual owners, and we let things go fallow. This idea of jubilee, when we're set free from debt. Oh gosh, how amazing would that be? Oh, that'd be so good. And by returning land to its rightful owners, it prevents a landholding class and a peasant class. That's the idea with Jubilee. And Brueggemann says Sabbath practice is, each one is a miniature Jubilee. And in this interpretive tradition, Sabbath is not simply a pause. It's an occasion for reimagining all of social life away from coercion and competition to compassionate solidarity. Such solidarity is imaginable and capable of performance only when the drivenness of acquisitiveness is broken. Sabbath is not simply the pause that refreshes, it is the pause that transforms. Whereas Israelites are always tempted to acquisitiveness, whereas Americans are always tempted to acquisitiveness, Sabbath is an invitation to receptivity, an acknowledgement that what is needed is given and not to be seized. I keep looking at myself and not the camera. That's why I don't do this for a living. Sabbath is not simply a pause that refreshes. It's the pause that transforms. When the cycle of acquisition is broken and we keep solidarity with our neighbors. That's aspirational, right? Like, I don't know that that's wholly descriptive of the realities of Sabbath that we see, but that's aspirational of what Sabbath ought to be if we practice. So at this point, if we were together, we would be close to out of time because you would have had lots of really good things to say. That would have been so smart. Oh, here, I gotta move to the study guide version. That would have been so smart and insightful. Um, the study guide, session 4, page 113. The second question is one I would like you to spend some time thinking through on your own, mulling over a little bit. Brueggemann spells out the consequences of our current state of fearfulness, our efforts to fence the world out in order to keep others out. Okay, so we're fearful. The world is fearful because we need more and more stuff. And if somebody else comes here, they might take my stuff. Okay, right? You're tracking me? You've seen that in America? Okay. Where do you see evidence of the desire to build fences or walls in our culture? Okay, so obviously there's that like border wall, but maybe besides that obvious one, where do you see evidence of the desire to build fences or walls in our culture? Okay, now this is one where we have to look at ourselves. That's one where we can just, think badly of other people, which is preferable than to actually examining ourselves, but this one's about us. Over what issues is the church currently embroiled in an effort to identify who belongs and who does not? And then finally, how do you respond to the proverb that good fences make good neighbors? Is that a proverb? I mean, that's a Robert Frost poem. Did he coin that? Or was it already a saying and he wrote the poem? I'll Google that later. But how would we respond that good fences make good neighbors? Because if you've read that poem, it's really more of a lament. Frost is not convinced that the good fence makes a good neighbor. I've read a lot of poetry because I'm very educated. And now it's time to move to the responding. We are doing responding out of session 4 this week because I like it. That's what we're going to do. And you know how to read, but I'll tell you real quick anyway. Commit to the following practices this week. In the coming week, use the spiritual practices of the examine to examine. Use the spiritual practice of examine to examine the good fruit and bad fruit in your day-to-day life. Okay? And so it invites you to light a candle, settle into stillness, and breathe. Allow yourself to become aware of God's presence. So center yourself. And then it has you reading Galatians, chapter 5, starting at 19, which is about the fruits of the Spirit. And then examining your own actions and attitudes and how you're evidencing fruits or not. And then after, you are supposed to sit in silence a little bit. So this week, in addition to trying to actually practice some Sabbath for yourself, in addition to considering how we can practice Sabbath to benefit our neighbors, our literal neighbors and our metaphorical neighbors, additionally, read the Fruits of the Spirit passage and spend time thinking about how our actions or attitudes are actually evidencing those fruits or not. This is our closing prayer. And I'm, again, using the closing prayer from session 4. In the time I've been talking to you, it's gotten dark outside, and the neighbor kids have taken their ball and gone inside. And, I'm kind of stressed out about the world, the state of the world. And I know that it isn't it's not my yoke to take up to save the world. I'm not the world's savior, not even y'all's savior, you have a real savior. But I feel responsibility for helping people and sharing the good news and for taking care of you in whatever ways I can. And I'm just looking at the world and it's dark out there and I don't know what's going to happen. And I've been describing it to people as like, there's this avalanche coming and I can see that the avalanche is coming. But it's not hit yet. I can't get away from it. I can't stop it. I know it's going to come. And then I don't know what to do in that meantime. And so maybe Sabbath, this idea of resisting the culture of production and consumption can be a bit of an antidote to that type of anxiety as well. So here's our closing prayer. And Walter Brueggemann wrote it based on Isaiah 56, 3-8. And he calls it, All of Us Gathered Together in Sabbath. It seems right and good to be God's chosen people. We enjoy friendship with God. We are assured special blessings from God. Best of all, we got the land of promise as our very own. John Stace. But then immediately other people began to crowd in on us. First, it was the Canaanites and the Philistines. Then it was the yellow threat from Asia. Later, it was all the intruders from south of the border. Now we have to contend with too many blacks and many insistent Native Americans who will not go away. And now it's the Muslims. It has turned out that all these others are now with us. They crowd us and disturb us and compete with us. Of necessity, we devised rules to protect our specialness. We formulated laws of purity and made a list of all those things that disqualified others. We made rules for race and ethnicity and gender and pedigree. We made it all safe and secure from all alarms. And then, right then, abruptly, you uttered your shattering words. It is for all peoples. My house, a house of prayer. When we blinked, we wondered, we debated. Did you say all peoples? All peoples like foreigners? All peoples like eunuchs? All peoples like Mexicans? All peoples like Muslims? We checked the text. We interrogated the ancient poet. We investigated your own ancient history of xenophobia, and the word was confirmed. You did say all peoples. In that utterance, you undid our sense of specialness. You undermined our purity laws and our best self-serving formulations. We looked and discovered, as we had not seen, the sweep and wonder of your governance, the largeness of your vision, and the expansiveness of your house of prayer. We looked and then noticed, as for the first time, that the company of those who trust you is very large, very mixed, very diverse. We watched and saw that you are gathering others alongside us. You have gathered us as your chosen, but your gathering does not stop with us. You gather others as your people. All of us, those who have long been chosen and others now gathered, all of us at prayer in your house, all of us at Sabbath in your creation, all of us together in covenant, all of us together according to your wide purpose. Amen. Well, my little screen timer says that you have listened to me for 44 minutes. That's assuming that you didn't just turn this off. I'll be in touch about church stuff for Sunday. And I will be in touch about how we will virtually gather for this meeting next week. Read your books, practice your Sabbath, and be blessed.